Welcome to the NGO Governance and Management course. The emergence of non-governmental organizations as formal institutions has been a relatively recent phenomenon. This course examines the organizational features, actor and stakeholder relationships, and the major topics of engagement contemporary NGOs confront. It further draws upon recent theoretical work and practicum to critically assess whether certain types of NGOs are more successful in negotiating the local and global institutional environments, as well as the management challenges facing NGOs and the tools they can use in response to adapt. NGOs are civil society organizations, private voluntary service organizations, who act as a third sector between the public and private sector. They can be relief agencies, welfare agencies. In fact, the majority of NGOs globally are social welfare oriented. NGOs can be public service contractors, popular development organizations, technical innovation organizations, grassroots development organizations, or advocacy groups and networks. Effectively, they are basically independent from the state. They have an emancipatory and participatory force in world politics. They are seen as a counterweight to state power. However, this does not mean that there cannot be other types of NGOs who are part of a corporate state environment. In this situation, the state is intimately linked with NGOs to the extent that there are government-organized NGOs. In fact, GONGOs for short, is a topic we will be looking at later on in our lecture series. So NGOs can be seen as partners of the state, and they can contribute to global governance. They can intervene at the international level in areas government cannot. For example, they can reach disadvantaged sectors or monitor and enforce agreements where states do not have the resources to do so. NGOs can be seen as part of the extended state, both nationally and globally. In global terms, we call them international NGOs, or INGOs for short. So INGOs or NGOs can contribute to the construction of the internalized state and building of internationalized state networks. Put differently, INGOs form a large part of the global civil society forum that is a thick social space of civil interaction. Global civil society will be a topic we will also explore later on in our lecture series. But as preview, we can suggest that INGOs are networks of organizations and citizens who come together to effect normative change both locally and globally. Over time, they can cause structural change. Another way to look at NGOs is seeing them as epistemic communities. Epistemic communities meaning knowledge communities. They're a network of professionals with recognized expertise and competence in a particular domain and an authoritative claim to policy-relevant knowledge within that domain or issue area. INGOs can be seen as having a shared set of normative and principal beliefs. They can be seen as having shared notions of validity. And finally, they can be seen as having a shared common policy enterprise. NGOs can be understood in three different facets. We can look at their sources of power, their main functions, and the dilemmas that they face in the everyday. In this slide, we're looking at NGO sources of power. And here we see that NGOs have various types of power. This includes material power, symbolic power, interpretive power, geographical power, and political standpoints. When we look at material power, we're looking at the size and budget that an NGO has. We're looking at its ability to acquire more resources. When we look at symbolic power, we're looking at the ability to have legitimacy in their statements. This may depend on being dependent on their material power. In other words, when we're looking at the sources of power, they're all interrelated, but for analytical purposes, we're disaggregating this. In other words, symbolic power and material power are intricately linked. NGOs have interpretive power. They have an ability to bring expertise to the forum and interpret social facts and experiences for a larger audience. Interpretive communities are the location where meaning is created and asserted in relation to a set of facts. So NGOs have this sort of symbolic capital amongst the publics having their ideas acknowledged. So again, we're seeing that sort of relationship between the symbolic power and the interpretive power. NGOs also have a geographical power, whether it's local or international. In other words, where an NGO is located allows it to provide the sort of requisite power it can use for using its symbolic or interpretive power. For instance, an NGO that's located in the local area, in the municipality, would have different types of powers than an NGO that is located more globally and can go from state to state. Finally, NGOs have a political standpoint. They have a particular value set and beliefs. So for instance, when we think of Greenpeace or Amnesty International, we know that there's a one-issue orientation for these types of NGOs, whereby Greenpeace is more environmentally oriented, whereas Amnesty International is about human rights and a civil and political human rights bent. So NGOs have these types of power. When we look at the main functions of NGOs, we can say they have four major functions. The first is setting the agenda. Setting the agenda means putting issues on the table. NGOs can apply pressures on political leadership. They can provide lobbying mechanisms, so to speak, to set the agenda. They can use the press to raise awareness to the mass public and to influence the agenda. They can mobilize the public opinion to again set the agenda. NGOs can affect negotiations. They can assist in the creation of agreements. Their epistemic understanding allows them to provide specialized information. NGOs can confer legitimacy. They can take opinions of the public and hence add legitimacy in their stance. Now, generally speaking, or shall I say traditionally speaking, legitimacy of NGOs are derived from noble, altruistic, and progressive goals they pursue in contribution to the common good. Now, in the later part of our lecture series, we'll be looking at how legitimate NGOs are in the different issues that they're looking at. For instance, looking at the environment or human rights or humanitarianism. What gives NGOs legitimacy to have a particular stance? Moreover, who do they really represent? Do they represent the citizenry, or do they represent a very minuscule and finite sort of stakeholders? These are questions we're going to be looking at when we engage in civil society and global civil society in our next few lectures. The fourth sort of function NGOs have is making solutions and agreements work. They're implementing decisions and they're acting as a monitoring agency. So for instance, if a nation state subscribes to a particular agreement, NGOs can actually monitor to see whether or not these states are actually abiding by the agreements that they set forth. NGOs do have numerous dilemmas. I have listed a few here that we will discuss throughout our lecture series, but let's go through each point and describe them in greater detail. The first dilemma NGOs face is maintaining the ideals of innovation and progress. Now, it is really interesting as we see NGOs mature, as we see NGOs become successful, we find often it's difficult for them to pivot to another issue area. So maintaining the ideals of innovation and progress is an inherent sort of issue that all NGOs face, notably successful ones. NGOs also face issues of democratic accountability. What we mean here is that NGOs has a legitimacy issue, as we talked about in the previous slide. Namely, who are NGOs accountable to? Are they solely accountable to their stakeholders? Are they accountable to the wider public? Are they accountable to the global civil society? Another dilemma NGOs face is questions of scale and efficiency. Are NGOs the most efficient form of an organization to actually make solutions work Are they the most efficient form of an organization to tackle certain policy issues? As we engage in the sort of themes throughout our lectures, we're going to question whether or not NGOs are the most responsible actors when it comes to engaging with certain policy issues. NGOs might be seen as being politically naive or socially irresponsible. Generally speaking, NGOs tend to be one issue oriented, which means that there may not be that sort of issue links that, say, governments might face insofar they're looking at it in a more macro perspective when it comes to issues. NGOs generally look at one particular issue in their operations. Thus, they may not see how, if they engage with the environment, it may affect another sort of realm in civil society or in the public at large. NGOs can undermine national and multilateral channels. Notably, if we look at international NGOs, we see that NGOs can jump from state to state in their operations, and they can actually undermine multilateral channels by virtue of doing that. Now, as we are going to look at in our future sort of lectures, we're going to see that many states, using a principal agent sort of conception, have utilized NGOs to circumvent, shall we say, directly interfering in the affairs of another state. Finally, one of the last dilemmas that NGOs can face is the quality of advice offered by advocacy groups. Namely, is the sort of advice being provided by NGOs, is it seen as being peer reviewed? Is it high quality advice? Now, many critics argue that NGOs might be biased in the sort of reports that they do and the studies that they do because they're one issue oriented, or they may not have a strong and rigorous peer review process. In this lecture, we've looked at the basic features of NGOs. We've looked at their mechanisms. We've looked at what makes them tick, so to speak. As we continue our lecture series, we'll be looking at global civil society, how civil society and the nation state interact with each other, and more acutely, how government and NGO relationships are morphed and evolved. We'll be looking at some very practical strategies when it comes to accountability mechanisms, advocacy strategies, and fundraising techniques. Finally, we'll be looking at different types of NGOs, particularly in issue area-oriented NGOs, notably looking at human rights NGOs, humanitarian sort of NGOs, and environmental NGOs. In our next lecture, we'll be looking at global civil society. I look forward to speaking to you then.